just came from a gathering that had America and Europe and all discussing about China. And I had a reflection on my plane coming over here this morning about, I mean, we take it all for granted, but it really is a mind blow to think about how things are different from whether we had this conversation even 6 months ago. I mean, obviously, you all live the shifts in the war and right on your border. There's a shift in the war in the Middle East ongoing all the time. There have been these significant elections in America and across Europe. Technology is changing daily. Deep-seek moments are happening many places in the world. NVIDIA CEO is saying China is now toe-to-toe with America and the West overall. I just came back from a month in India. It's open for business. I was in Riyadh. It's open for business. It's just on and on. But in all of this, there is clearly a revolution happening, regulatorily, structurally, in the quantity of money in defense tech. And like any time there's a bunch of buzz and hype, it's very hard to filter what is real and what is not. And so that's the purpose of this discussion writ large, but particularly with this extraordinary resource of what we have in the UK right now. So, Grace, you not only are a superb investor, not only do you think about these issues for well over a decade of your career, you've just been a central asset in reviewing a brand new strategic defense review, which is going to come out in 2 weeks, which I think is going to lay many things already quoted by both the chancellors and the prime minister. Can you just start by right-setting us? Just let us know, in all the noise and all the cacophony in this crazy world, what are the things we should be watching and thinking about most?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. So I think the first and most obvious thing that's happened in the last couple of months is really the removal of the US security umbrella for Europe, right? I think that's pretty clear. It's pretty clearly articulated by the new administration that Europe needs to stand up and take charge of its own defense in a way that it hasn't really had to for a number of decades. So I think that's point number one. That is a reality that I think is here to stay. I think among all that heat and light, there's a couple of other really important realities to focus on. The first is that there is a lot of new money coming into this space, both on the buyer side, so the government side. We see numerous countries announcing significant increases in their defense spending, the UK among them. We've made a commitment to increase our spend to 2.5% of GDP in 2 years, and then to 3% at some point around 2030. Other countries making similar moves. The EU has obviously announced a $150 billion euro fund for defense investment. The Germans have made an enormously significant decision around lifting their debt ceiling. So that money is real. There is also an enormous amount of private investment capital flowing into this space. Again, I think it's reflective of enthusiasm for this subject, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, which has made clear that there is a need to invest in these kind of technologies. And so there's sort of private capital as well as public capital that's really flowing in. So that's a real shift among the kind of noise. And I think the other is the tempo shift that we've all observed over the last few years. The pace at which technology is changing, the pace at which the battlefield has become cognitive, automated, happening in real time. That is a reality that our defense forces need to deal with and need to adapt to, and it becomes an imperative to find the right technology, buy it faster and better, and use it as effectively as possible in order to derive value from it.
I want to, in a way, marry your public service mindset with what it means to be an investor, because as you know from your public service, you work for Tony Blair, you have served your country in many very powerful and interesting ways internationally. Folks love big numbers, they love big headlines, and so these numbers get all thrown around in very interesting ways. So then put on your investor hat. Is there a sense of priority that entrepreneurs should be thinking about in those aggregate numbers? Or is this, you're open for business and you'll do whatever you can? How do we think about the practicality of a number those numbers that are that large?
Yeah, so I think for this audience, for the kind of startup entrepreneurship world, the priority, I think, is to focus on the parts of government which are deliberately seeking to procure emerging solutions. So we have these big numbers for defense budget, but a lot of that is effectively pre-allocated to long-term programs, whether it's submarines, frigates, F-35s, and so on. It's quite hard to access those budgets if you're a startup, but we, in our review in the UK, have advocated very hard for part of the budget, the equipment budget in defence, to be formally ring-fenced, to be spent on novel emerging technologies produced by emerging players. That is, I think, the first time that's been done in a sort of large-scale defence budget. So Chancellor announced 10% of our equipment budget, which is quite a large sum. It's several £100 million, will be formally ring-fenced and protected in order to spend on emerging technology. So I think for people in the Latitude community, that's the area to focus, right? And alongside that budget commitment, Chancellor also announced the creation of a new body to be called UK Defence Innovation, which is a new agency which will deploy that money and will have a mandate to make it much easier to access contracts with defence, because I'm sure many of you know it's not been easy. And as a small supplier or a young supplier, it can be very hard to break down those doors, to know where to go, to get into a contract that is meaningful beyond experimentation. You're kind of forced to hire a retired general or someone to kind of try and open the right door for you. And my hope for UK Defence Innovation, this new agency, is that it will level the playing field for other kinds of suppliers who can come and get access to that ring-fence money and get faster into contract at a significant scale.
So I'm going to come back to regulatory, and in fact, I think what is the most important issue is certainly all the defense tech companies that I'm involved with pull out their hair like I to talk about procurement processing.
Yeah.
You've touched on it. I want to come back to it.
Yeah.
Let me keep you higher just for another minute or two, because I'm asking you really now as a hardcore investor and looking at young entrepreneurs in this space. We have learned so much from our brave sisters and brothers in the Ukraine and elsewhere about how war has changed.
Yeah.
War has changed in its element, of course, of information war, obviously in swarm war and drones. How do you think, as an investor, with this money available, perhaps movement and procurement, but with a whole generation of extraordinary entrepreneurs with a new learning, how is your conversation, as you think and assess these young women and men, different than if we had this conversation 3 years ago?
So I come back to this word tempo or pace again, that you need entrepreneurs who are willing and able to work at pace, to iterate very quickly. Now, you might say most entrepreneurs are like that by instinct. And the problem in defence has typically been that the customer is not able to operate at that tempo and to iterate quickly. But I think entrepreneurs who have that appetite to work fast and an appetite to partner with the buyers inside defence who know they need to walk that path, they know they need to improve at this. So a kind of partnering mindset to help them to get where they need to go. I think there are some other themes in terms that you mentioned, autonomous weapons and swarms and so on, all of that, absolutely yes, that's the direction it's going in. I think there are some other themes as well that, both as an investor and as a citizen are important to think about. One of those is the ability to endure in a conflict, both above and below the threshold of war. So many of you will be very familiar with the fact that we are, in many respects, already at war every day in the grey zone. Cyber attacks daily coming into certainly UK, many of the UK's allies. This is a reality that we are already facing this kind of attack, and we have to be able to endure long term in that kind of environment. That requires us to have resilient and secure communications networks, stronger emphasis on cybersecurity, stronger emphasis on supporting our critical national infrastructure, particularly one of my favourite subject areas, which is undersea critical infrastructure, which I think is highly vulnerable at the moment, and there's a lot of very interesting technological solutions to help us deal with that better. But that's one theme I think as an investor is very interesting, and as a citizen too, that endurance point. Then you have interoperability. And the reality that I think we, the UK, I can't imagine a scenario we're going to fight a war alone. We're going to be fighting with our allies. We will be supporting our allies if they're drawn into conflict. Interoperability is at the heart of everything. Again, as an investor, you have to find companies which have that in their DNA, which are embracing open standards of software, which are embracing simple software architectures, making it easier for users in defense to connect everything to everything else, often at the edge, to process at the edge, and in constrained environments. So that interoperability, I think, is another really important theme as an investor. And again, this point about tempo, the ability to iterate as fast as possible.
I'm going to tie a little bit more into cyber because that's also an area that you've had long expertise in. I was in Taiwan about 3 or 4 months ago, and I think that I know a little bit more than the average person on this issue, but I'm not an expert. But I realized within half an hour of being briefed on what China is doing in cyber today, particularly with AI. I mean, thousands and thousands of people who do not exist, followed by hundreds of thousands of people who do exist, with a messaging and capability. I concluded I know shit. I concluded I knew nothing when I saw what was coming, and I'm actually convinced that Taiwan is sort of an incubator of what we should be seeing elsewhere. Am I right? And if I am, how does that instruct how entrepreneurs can be thinking about how AI is changing this game, particularly in that new element of war?
Yeah, I think you are right. I think cyber is an incredibly interesting and significant part of our threat picture. People typically are thinking about threats from hypersonic missiles or the growth of the Chinese nuclear weapons stockpile and so on, all of which are, of course, enormously valid threats to be preparing for. But cyber as a vector has been growing for some time, and I think will continue to grow for some time. As you said, misinformation, disinformation is one part of that. It's incredibly easy now to conduct misinformation, disinformation campaigns, as you saw in Taiwan. It's easy to do that with AI. It's very sophisticated, and it's actually pretty hard to defend against. It's easier to do than to defend against. There are interesting companies out there that are doing good work to defend against it, but it is challenging. And I think if I come back to critical national infrastructure, I think the hybrid war that we've seen some of in Ukraine and elsewhere, this ability to combine kinetic action with action in the cyber zone can be very powerful as a future tool. And even if you take the kinetic aspect out of it altogether, just conducting cyber-based operations in the grey zone against undersea cables, power stations, or even, frankly, the business community, right, can be enormously disruptive to a country's ability to operate normally. So you're right that it is. It's hard. It's as an investor, cyber is, in many ways, it's a great theme to invest in because it's very resilient. It's not going away. The attacks are not diminishing. It's not a place for tourists. You do have to kind of know your stuff if you're looking in that space. But what encourages me is that phenomenal entrepreneurs who operate in the field of cyber defense, there's some really exceptional builders in that space. And AI can be as helpful to the defenders as it is to the attackers. So it's important to remember that for every AI-powered cyber attack, we're seeing increasing amounts of AI-powered cyber defense.
That excites you, both as an investor and in what you do in the government. So tell us a little bit, if you could set us a bit about our adversaries. What have you learned in this terrible war that Russia has started? What have you learned in China's very aggressive advances, not just in Taiwan, but outside the Philippines and whatever, with unbelievable technology? Yeah. How do you assess our adversary and the adversary challenge today versus if we had this conversation even 2 years ago?
Yeah, so I think our adversaries have made enormous progress in the last few years. China in particular, incredible investment into all sorts of, if you like, pure defense and quasi-defense technologies. So enormous build-up of long-range conventional and nuclear missiles. The stockpile of their nuclear weapons is expected to double by 2030. And they have really embraced the civil-military fusion to bring AI and autonomy from their private sector really well integrated into their defense establishment. So, I think they've made incredible strides in what they do. Russia, although under sanctions, has adapted, I think, pretty effectively in technological terms, has been able to experiment, iterate, particularly in its use of the electromagnetic spectrum. We've seen very fast turnover, particularly in the drone space, that the Russians have been able to take out drones at a pretty impressive pace. So I think it shows that even in constrained environments, if you innovate well, you can still be very effective. So I think those two have done a good job, I think, in their technological innovation. And I would also observe that the growing use of what the military calls COTS systems, so commercial off-the-shelf systems, drones being the most, famous example. The fact that those are now much more available to a wider range of potential adversaries presents us with other challenges to defend against. It, if you like, democratizes military power that used to be the preserve of a government, and now that's not the case anymore. And it has changed the economics of defense too. Again, we've seen that in Ukraine, that a very cheap drone can take out a much more expensive piece of hardware that's perhaps taken years to build and develop. Yeah. So the economics is shifting as well among our, in terms of what our adversaries can bring to bear.
A member of the audience asked a wonderful and important question along these lines, which is, we can talk all about relative technology, we can talk about capability, but some of that doesn't matter if you don't have the critical minerals access, which of course China has done incredibly well. Yeah. How should we think about access to critical minerals? Are you seeing, there's a company in America called Cobalt, many of you will know, who is using AI to not only find lithium more easily, but with robotics to mine difficulty much cheaper than historically. But we may not know if that works for years. So how do you assess, and what opportunities might there be to think about the critical mineral side, as the questioner asked?
Yeah, as you say, I think there are some very interesting companies doing different kinds of like mapping and location of minerals and new, more efficient ways of extracting them. So I think that is important. I think, I would say that relationships with allies, despite what it has sometimes felt like in the last few months with the noise coming out of Washington, I think allies remain an enormously important part of what, if you like, the Western powers have to our advantage, right? So there are countries with whom we are long-standing allies who have access to these minerals, and so we need to work with them. We need to partner. We need to help each other to extract and make use of them. So, I think partnership is not dead yet.
I mentioned earlier that you'd been part of this strategic defense review overall. Was access to critical minerals, but even steel, another questioner asked about just basic stuff in the supply chain challenges and opportunities we have today. Has that changed in your thinking? Is that a concern, or you feel that we're pretty good on that?
We look at that. It hasn't been a huge feature, I would say. I think we've focused quite a lot of our energy around fixing the way that defense finds, buys, and uses technology. So the money, as we were saying at the beginning, headline numbers of money is great. Big numbers, everybody likes to report it. But it doesn't count for anything if you're just spending it on the same old stuff that's already obsolete. So what we really wanted to see was a focus on accepting that procurement has to change, that it has been optimized for decades for buying equipment that takes 10, 20 years to buy, and it's a very long-term program. That is not appropriate for today's type of warfare. And so our Defense Secretary just this week was talking about some of our recommendations which look at explicitly segmenting the market and saying, yes, there will still be the need to buy ships and tanks and planes. But instead of that taking an average of 7.5 years, which, believe it or not, was the number that we discovered is the average length of a procurement, that will now come down to 2 years. Then for modular upgrade to those platforms, it should take no more than 1 year. And for the fast turnover, really cutting-edge technology that might become obsolete quickly and get upgraded quickly, that should take 3 months. So this is the new targets that our review will lay on defense. It's going to be culturally very challenging for them to deliver that. If you're used to operating on a 7-year time frame, 3 months is a radical change, and we will see how they do. But that's really where a lot of our effort has focused on, really making sure that we don't just talk about engaging with different kinds of suppliers. We don't just talk about pace and tempo, but we actually force it into our system.
I want to double click on this issue and pull us where you can with as much detail as you can, because there is not a defense tech company I've met in America, in India, in Europe, or anyone else who said, I don't care about the money. I'm pleased that people are announcing multi-billion-dollar commitments, but great ideas always get capital. What I care about is I cannot sell my product efficiently to whatever government I'm picking. You know, I asked someone who's an expert in America to actually give me some hard analysis on this, and they really couldn't as well as you just did. So I went to GPT, of course. And to double click on your point with an added thing which is very important, in America for basic sort of aircraft and so on, 7 to 10 years just in the regulatory process and testing. But that's not actually the build, all right? 5 to 7 years in other Western countries. China, 1 to 2 years today, not 3 years from now, today. So when you look at that and you say it's very hard, and a bunch of Europeans recently said to me, Chris, you know we love our regulation. The math does not hold. So what do we think about in the uncertain period that we are on, which is clearly going to put demands, where people say 5% is a big deal, because it is in terms of money spent, but has no meaning vis-a-vis the tempo that you keep emphasizing in this conversation. So how do we actually get there, as opposed to think this is what we ought to do in a normative sense?
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. I think frankly, we in the West have talked for too long about the importance of technology. You know, we're not the first review who said this is important, right? Just nothing's really fundamentally changed in how that regulation around procurement happens. So we hope that the combination of formally ring-fencing 10% of our equipment budget for novel tech, so if you have to spend that money on emerging tech, then you're incentivized to go and make sure that you find those companies to spend it on, coupled with a requirement to contract with those companies in 3 months within a new entity that has been set up specifically to do that.
That's it.
And sits within it's kind of boring for most of you, but a new entity in defense called the National Armaments Directorate, which has been elevated in seniority terms to be on a par with our Chief of Defense and the most senior official in defense. So there will be 3 people at the top of defense now, 1 in uniform and 2 civilians, 1 civilian being the head of policy, and the other being the National Armaments Director, who will make sure, or will be required, to report to the Defense Secretary and Parliament on whether they are delivering that money that's ring-fenced for emerging tech in the time frame that they're being required to do it. Sounds great on paper.
Well, I'm going to stick with you one more time, and I'm asking you as much as an investor, and I'm not asking you to reveal anything that you can about the report till it comes out and everything else. But let's talk briefly about carrot and sticks. I mean, there was a time, many of you will remember, when America made, I'm making these numbers up, but the order of magnitude, what I'm saying is correct, 70 aircraft a month.
Yeah.
And Franklin Roosevelt brought in a bunch of manufacturers, some of whom have never made an aircraft before, and said in a year, we need 70,000 a month.
Yeah.
And it happened because it was very clear, not only was there huge economic incentive, but people were going to get punished if they didn't. Are people at that moment now, is there an attitudinal shift that we look at the world and say, this is a moment that has to be business as usual, and there will be repercussions, both on the positive side in terms of get capital or not, but also other repercussions if we don't move into the kind of environment and speed that our adversaries have?
I think that's understood at a political level. I think anyone who's spent time in Ukraine has seen the reality of this and the need for the rest of Europe to catch up in many ways, to what we've seen happening there. So I think it's understood at a political level that this needs to become business as usual, that we can't go on as we have been in the past. Honestly, I think the jury's out on how easy it will be to make that business as usual. There's nothing like a crisis to force action like this. It took COVID to accelerate digital transformation in lots of businesses and in government. It's taken the Ukraine wake-up call for people to understand the importance of integrating novel technology faster. But I think, I fear that without a very precipitate, near-feeling crisis,
it's hard.
It will be hard work, and so it will require really committed political leadership to hold those senior people to account to deliver at the pace that we need them to. I think there's also a window here as regards the capital. So there's a huge enthusiasm in the VC community for this defense tech space at the moment. Lots of new funds emerging all the time, lots of the generalist investors shedding their concerns about defense and suddenly moving into that space. My feeling is that we have a 2-year window for defense ministries to make use of that enthusiasm. And if a VC has backed 3 or 4 defense tech companies on the promise of all this money that's flying in and we're going to change procurement and we're going to do things differently, if in 2 years there still hasn't been any meaningful contracting, and by meaningful I don't mean innovation, experimental projects of 50 or 100 grand, I'm talking about meaningful scaled contracts where new technology is really making a difference in frontline scenarios. If we haven't shown that for real within 2 years, I think that capital will go elsewhere, because capital is, it's fungible, it can go where it likes, it'll find the next thing that's hot and interesting. So I think we have to make this work. 2 years is my guess, other people might have a different view on it, but I think VCs have also got pretty short attention span, and we need to show that you can do good business in this area in a short time.
We have 1 minute left. You have a bunch of builders in this room where 2 years is a lifetime. They're thinking about the next 6 months. They're fired up and ready to go. They'll run into regulatory challenges eventually, but now they want to build.
Yeah.
You are a wonderful both investor and advisor to young entrepreneurs in this space in the UK and beyond. What's the biggest message you want to leave them with coming out of this reality?
Don't give up on defense. I feel that it would be understandable for a lot of entrepreneurs to find it hard to imagine doing a lot of business with defense, given how hard it has been for a long time. Don't give up on it. There are good people inside these defense forces who desperately want to work with you as builders and founders. You have to make a choice about where you build. Every single NATO member state wants you to come and build. In their country, they want you to be there so they can export, and they want to build their industrial complex to a more diverse and deeper-rooted situation. You've got to pick somewhere to go. I would encourage you to go where you see real evidence that contracts are being let. Don't follow where people talk about capital, because like you say, good ideas will always get funded. Governments that talk too much about doing VC, personally, I wouldn't go there. I would go where they are demonstrating that they are letting contracts in a short period of time to young companies.
What an honor to be with you and to share these reflections. So if you could please thank her.
Thank you. Thanks.